Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles, je t'aime, your News' weekly talk show. On Brussels, my love, we zoom in on some of the stories in the news. Hear what's at stake for you and for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, Europe's housing dilemma was under discussion in Strasbourg. MEPs agreed their stance for proposed draft law that would harmonise rules on short-term rentals. Since the arrival of Airbnb and Booking.com, regular renters are getting pushed out of their own cities from Lisbon to Dublin. With Europe so focused on external relations, we're asking if Brussels can help out here and what cities have already found the way alone. And it's been hailed as a landmark law to protect media pluralism and independence. MEPs voted this week on a bill that would set legally binding standards to preserve press freedom in the EU. With reports of journalists in Greece being spied on and press freedom under threat, we check if this Media Act will have any teeth or if countries that created it will choose to ignore it. A warm welcome to our panel this week. Dorte Nielsen, Executive Director at Eurocities. Petros Vassoulas, Secretary-General at the European Movement. And Kate Bolingaro, Managing Editor at MLEX. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. This week was pretty intense, I must say. There was a plenary session in Strasbourg. There was a big summit in Granada about EU enlargement and migration. But we want to focus on Europe's housing crisis. So first, Luis Albertus tells us more.
Boiling point in Lisbon. After a summer of record tourism and growing gentrification, thousands took to the streets to call for the right to housing. In Portugal, the average wage is €1,200 and rents have gone through the roof. And it is not the only country suffering from a housing crisis. It is a similar picture in Dublin, the most expensive state in the whole EU for housing, 94% above average. Meanwhile, France has a real estate emergency, with soaring interest rates pushing mortgages up and raw materials few and far between. The German Chancellor even held an emergency housing summit last week. Meanwhile, in Strasbourg, MEPs agreed on a negotiating mandate for short-term rentals. With so much at stake, we ask if this is all too little, too late.
So I'll perhaps start with yourself, Dorte Nielsen, because Eurocities, you have your eyes and your ears on the ground across the continent. How serious is this crisis in your eyes? And should the EU be getting more involved? Can it?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's lots to do still. Now, for this little intro that we've seen, it's very recognizable to the concerns that we've heard from our membership, so the largest cities in Europe, for the past many years. And there is, combined sort of with the rising house prices and the income that isn't rising at the same level, on the contrary with the inflation, it is a very difficult situation. Many people are struggling in the cities. And we have generally a situation where vulnerable groups in particular are facing very difficult situation in finding affordable housing. There is a lack of affordable housing and social housing in cities, and of course has implications for social cohesion in cities and livability. And if we look at there were some examples mentioned here in the clip.
And I was looking as well this week at this report from Housing Europe. They've put together what the situation is across the board, because obviously in every EU member state it is different. But I'd like to just discuss this week over in Strasbourg. We saw MEPs get together and discuss that idea of decent housing for all. And it's a discussion I haven't seen take place really very much as it should, perhaps. Do you think, Kate, there's a feeling of guilt that the EU is also perhaps a little bit complicit for former fiscal policies that were introduced back many years ago that are aggravating the situation today?
Well, I think this has mainly been dealt with at a municipal level in a lot of cases, or a regional level. You know, we've seen cities putting in sort of a cap on what percentage of housing can be used for Airbnb, or stricter rules as to who's allowed to run an Airbnb and what the taxes are associated with that. So I do think the EU now has sort of been waking up and saying, hang on, maybe there is a place for us to legislate here, try to give some support that would give it across the board, because obviously there's a single market that they have to consider as well. And the rules that are applying in one city or in one region, it can also just have a distortion effect if it's not carried out across the union. So I think that they are taking a look at that and saying, okay, we clearly have some pressures now with rising interest rates and the cost of living crisis. There's a lot of political pressure. So I think they're responding to a general call from younger folks to actually make housing affordable and, let people have a dream of buying a house, because I think there's a lot of people out there that may never actually be able to buy their own home.
Indeed,
sure.
and that was the argument this week, that a house shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a human right. Let's just hear from Petros and then we'll bring yourself back in.
Indeed, this is one of the real challenges that we're facing. Obviously, over the past few years, we have dealt with the pandemic, we are dealing with the war in Ukraine, of course the climate crisis is upon us and everybody is realizing that this affects us. But I think the houses is a very present and clear and personal challenge we all face. Myself, our elder son was going to university and we were exploring the options for him, and certain countries were out of question exactly because of the housing challenges. We thought about going to Ireland, your native country. Of course, couldn't find the appropriate accommodation there for him. So this is something that's really affecting a lot of people, young especially, and it has a potential of creating this intergenerational chasm between people who can afford property and people who will never be on the property.
Situation critical in Ireland, and also I was reading in Barcelona, 83% of young people are still living with their parents at 30. Imagine, that is just not the way the world should be going. Dorothy, quick comment for you, and then I'd like to show you something.
I wanted just to come back to the point about the fiscal policies as well, and how this has a role, because I think the situation that cities are finding themselves in when they try to sort out the housing locally is the counter pressures of, for example, the Stability and Growth Pact at European level that has over time sort of hampered the ability to take long-term investments into housing. There are other rules as well. So where housing isn't sort of an EU competence as such, there are many policies at European level that has an impact and an impact of the city's ability also to act. And in addition to that, of course, we have also the tourism coming in.
And just to go back to that debate that I mentioned in Strasbourg this week, because among those debating was the Portuguese Socialist MEP, Pedro Marques. And like many MEPs, his main message was that the EU can't just hide behind the fact that 80 million people in Europe do not have access to decent accommodation and 895,000 people are homeless.
It's complex, the situation in Portugal, but as I said, in many countries, in all big cities in Europe at this stage, the mayors are crying out for help. And really, when people start saying, oh, this is not a European competence, I mean, don't come with that kind of speech. It was also not our competence with the vaccines, and we did it. It's a matter of political will. When you have, as you have now, a clear market failure in the housing market in Europe, when the youngsters cannot get an affordable house, when even the employed families, the working families, suddenly they cannot pay their mortgages, then if there is a market failure, you need some public regulation.
Pedro Marques there, the MEP speaking to Arshandra Ziros, telling him that mayors are crying out for help. I guess you're familiar with and very probably close to many of the mayors across the continent. What's going on? Are they being ignored?
So I think that we are looking at an investment gap into the housing, into the affordable housing market and social housing market, which is 57 billion annually. It was also raised by Commissioner Smith yesterday in the European Parliament during the debate. So I think some cities have successfully managed to push this issue up the European agenda, but it's taken many years. What we call the European Urban Agenda set up a housing partnership in 2017, and that partnership saw then member states, cities working together, European Commission on an action plan that put forward some proposal for what action needs to be taken at the different levels of government. It's more relevant than ever now.
Well, let's talk about some of those actions. I mean, are there proposals on that, for example, like giving bonuses to young people to rent or to buy a house, like when you buy a new car, for example? Many companies do that. I mean, we need to have some creative ideas here.
Certainly, more investment is part of it. The planning that we haven't done for years in terms of the housing needs that we have. Addressing also the fact that property has become an asset that a lot of people invest in without actually using it. We have a lot of city centres where accommodation that could be perfectly suitable for a lot of people is left unused, exactly because it's seen as an investment. And what we do.
So should the owners of those houses perhaps get taxed for that, get higher? They must pay perhaps a higher property gains tax?
I think it really depends also as well who owns it. I think what we've seen a lot as well is big companies, investment firms actually buying up property and banks. So this is really interesting as well, where you look at the ownership. If you have, a private individual owning a house, it's not necessarily the same thing as when, a big firm comes in and can buy up 20, 30, 40 apartments. I think that's where it's also interesting from a legislative perspective. Who do you tackle? What do you tackle? Are these international companies? Are these European companies? Are they local? And it's obviously a different take than maybe one person who buys one extra apartment versus, an investment firm with multi-billion-dollar budgets, and they've got... And
multi-billion-dollar budgets, they could absolutely afford a little bit more taxes. It would just be a case of accounting, like changing a couple of figures on a sheet. But I just want to show our viewers as well the picture across Europe now. According to Eurostat, it's gone from bad to worse. House prices went up by 49% in the last decades, rents by 18% and inflation by 25%. Now, we're talking about up to 2022 here. I did see a note the other day, actually this week, about prices going down in some parts, but in general, it's choking people. And when people go to the bank, they can't even get a mortgage. Interest rates are high. You have countries as well like Portugal where, you have variable interest rates as well, and people are being really, really choked today.
Mm-hmm. We have in some examples from cities like Bratislava, which is one of the least affordable cities in Europe, where this mismatch between revenue, so income, and the house prices is one of the largest. And so in terms of sort of finding innovative solutions, thinking out of the box, and because privatization has also meant that there is very little social housing or even affordable housing on the market, the city government has made an open call to private house owners if they can rent back their houses to the city government so that they can put it into the availability of tenants who needs it.
And that contributes to the sense of inequality that our fellow citizens feel, the lack of opportunity that has huge political consequences. We have seen in polling we have been doing over the last 5-6 years a sense of disempowerment. People feel left behind. And when our fellow citizens feel that way, they might fall victim or prey to those populist politicians who make cheap promises and attack the establishment. And that has contributed to a large extent also to the ballooning in the support for anti-establishment, far extreme parties who are gaining power across Europe.
Well, Petrus, we'll find out, won't we, next year when people vote, if they vote in those elections. But just to give a good example, I know in Vienna, the situation there is pretty much solved. They've managed to find a good solution. But first, I'd like to go back to what you mentioned earlier, Kate, about Airbnb, because actually this week in the European Parliament, there was a decision on a negotiating mandate from the European Parliament on a short-term rentals draft law proposal. And the Dutch MEP, Kim van Sparentak, she's been in charge of that dossier. And our reporter in Strasbourg, Chandra Zeros, had a chance to chat to her. Take a listen.
The main thing it will bring is that municipalities can actually know what is happening in their cities. Right now, it's completely opaque how many rooms, how many nights, how many apartments are rented out. And with this law, we make sure that if municipalities want to have the information, they can actually get it, and the platforms will have to provide all the data they have. There's a lot of people that just feel that they're not at home anymore in their street, where, half of the houses are changing occupants every 3 days. So the cities are becoming dirtier, more expensive, and more loud and noisy. So people are really craving for some rules around this.
Kim van Sparentak there. So does it go far enough, do you think, this legislation, Kate?
Well, I think that it's a start, at least to get the conversation going. And as we are heading into the European elections in June, and there's more and more talk about cost of living and salaries, for instance. I mean, I think part of the root of this problem is also looking at the fact that salaries have not always risen as fast as prices have. And in Belgium, we do have, obviously, wages pegged to inflation, but that's very rare. So a lot of folks that have seen inflation drive prices up across the board for their cost of living, including housing, they're not necessarily able to keep up because their salary is just not growing fast enough. And it's been years on years tacking onto that.
And this, I guess, sends a signal to cities, what was decided on this, even though we saw Florence take a decision themselves this week that they will ban short-term rentals in the historic city centre.
Yes, and give a tax relief to those landlords who actually put their houses back on the market for a normal rent. But I want to say on the short-term holiday rental and what has been decided in the European Parliament, what is really important is data. So data sharing, and that this act, if it's going to be if it goes through the full legislative process and adopted as it is, it's going to force those online platforms who are not yet doing it to share the data that they have with the local authorities so that they know what's on the market, that it's possible to enforce the local rules as well. So it creates a much better operating environment where it's easier for local governments to then make sure that what is on the market is legal, first of all, that it respects the percentages that has maybe been set at local level and doesn't undermine efforts to ensure that there is housing for people who need it for living in the cities.
And just on that note, obviously we don't have anyone around the table here from Airbnb or Booking.com, but I did reach out to them and they sent us this comment, a reaction to the short-term rentals. It was the head of EU Affairs, Georgina Browse, who told us that Airbnb in fact already shares data with authorities in Europe and Eurostat. But they said local rules are different on EU-wide rules and they will streamline data sharing between platforms and authorities. So they told me that they very much welcomed this short-term rentals proposal, Petros, that it's a win-win. I mean, time will tell, really.
And often a lot of private companies welcome legislation because especially EU legislation harmonizes rules across the board. That's the big advantage of having a common market, and that's what we should drive. We shouldn't forget that being able to rent your place on a short-term basis also adds to the income of people that might be under pressure. You're on holiday with your family, then you can rent your place and you can make a few extra euros there. But again, legislation, because we have had a Wild West kind of situation over the past few years, will make things easier both for consumers, but also for the platforms and hopefully for the cities themselves.
Reaction?
It's definitely going to be interesting to watch what they're going to be doing. And, we are seeing more and more regulation on platforms in general with the Digital Markets Act and, everything that they're going to have to be doing as well with the DSA also. I mean, that's another issue. So I think now there's more rules coming in place overall for platforms, which obviously also will bring more harmonization across the bloc.
And meanwhile, while we wait, of course, for that legislation to kick in and to have an impact on the ground, perhaps from a Eurocities perspective, could you talk us through why cities like Vienna have got it right and how perhaps we could copy and paste some of these policies?
So Vienna is a unique city in many ways, but what they've done on housing is based on the principle and the value that housing is a right. It's not a privilege. It's not a luxury. It's a right. And so when other cities in the 80s and the 90s sold out of their social housing project, Vienna didn't do it. So they own their houses that they have and the land. They still do it, which means that high percentages of the population lives in subsidized housing. It helps keep prices down. It helps ensure an adequate amount of accessible housing on the market. It really is a very unique position that Vienna has on this. Where for other cities, once you sold the assets, it's a different process, of course. It's a different policies that come into play.
And just Petros, as the Greek around the table, when it comes to social housing, there wasn't much said. There was nothing in that proposal on that. I mean, should we see the EU step in there?
Indeed, I think the question of competence will always haunt us in this particular case, but we do need a holistic approach here because people are not just priced out of owning a property, they're actually struggling to find somewhere to live, or they end up living in very cramped circumstances, and that undermines opportunity. If you are a high school student trying to prepare for your exams and you live with your family in one bedroom with another 3 siblings, of course it makes it difficult to do your homework. So that has an effect on the opportunities that people have later in life. And it is the duty of the state, whether it's at the local, national or European level, to provide everybody with equal opportunity. impunity. So I do think it's high time and long overdue that the EU stepped in this area, identify the challenges, work together with organizations like Eurocities and civil society on the ground. There's a lot of civil society organizations who will help families and individuals with housing to ensure that we provide everyone with that fundamental basic right, which is the right to having a roof over your head.
Perhaps time to have an EU summit dedicated just to housing. I mean, we saw Olaf Scholz hold a summit on this because, of course, there's the raw materials crisis as well. The construction industry has been kind of grinded to a halt, so maybe something for the European Commission President to consider. But that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for. We will certainly come back to that topic. Thank you so much for your views and thank you for watching. Don't go anywhere, though, because after the break, we'll be telling you about a little win for press freedom this week. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with Dordy Nielsen, Petros Vassoulis and Kate Bolangaro, we are taking a look at some of the news stories of the week. And one that hit the headlines here, and perhaps across the continent, was the much anticipated European Parliament vote on the European Media Freedom Act. 448 MEPs voted in favour of new rules to protect editorial independence and media pluralism. 102 against, and 75 decided to abstain. Now, Renate Schroeder is from the European Federation of Journalists, and she's been following this topic for years. She welcomed the outcome.
We are very happy that the European Parliament adopted with a great majority a text on the European Media Freedom Act, which has been much improved since its first draft. We needed it yesterday, but we will be happy if we get it tomorrow. Freedom of the media is threatened in Europe, be it by politicians, smear campaigns against journalists, in a time when the sustainability of journalism is also threatened, when big platforms not only take all the data, but also the money on advertisement. This will be a regulation, so it has immediate national effect. So we may have to go back to the courts to enforce what is needed.
Renate Schroeder there. So I think we need to start with Kate, right, for this one, the member of the press around the table. Your take perhaps on that act, and also, have you ever been censored?
I think it's a really exciting law. I believe journalism is one of the key pillars of democracy. So for me as a journalist also, I always welcome protections for myself and for my colleagues working in the media industry. I personally have never been censored myself, but I have seen cases where, if there's a prominent media owner or a prominent advertiser, there's always, consideration for how they would be impacted by reporting, and I think that that's something that a lot of journalists are confronted with, and especially in countries that have less and less media freedom and less press plurality. There's a lot more struggle there. We have seen Europe backsliding on that. And I think it's quite scary to see as a journalist when you see, attacks on journalists being killed, Daphne Caruana Galizia, who for her work on the anti-corruption work in Malta, or, there was a Slovak journalist killed around the same time in 2017. There was the journalist in Amsterdam just last year or 2 years ago, I believe. And, all of that, when you see that in the heart of Europe, that people are being killed for doing their job and trying to bring to light these tough situations, I think it's critical that, there is a law there that does protect media.
It will, of course, be up to the countries, the member states themselves to enforce it. Is it something that at Eurocities you're taking a look at? Is it of concern for your cities?
So I think our perspective is slightly broader. What we see a lot of mobilization from the local political leaders that we are working with is around the protection of democratic values and democratic freedoms. And of course, the press freedom is an essential part of that. So for example, the Pact of Free Cities that was started by the Visegrad 4 mayors some years ago has been very active and mobilized in that bloc.
Visegrad 4, maybe tell our viewers. Hungary, Slovakia,
Poland, yeah.
Poland.
Yes.
Petros, your take?
Well, freedom of press is a fundamental pillar of a democracy, and the mere fact that we feel the need to protect it goes to show to what extent our democracy itself is under threat, and not just in countries like Hungary, where we have seen a leader and a political party seize, in effect, private and public news outlets, but we're seeing it slowly creeping all across our continent.
And there's data, in fact, to back up what you're saying. We were taking a look at an interesting report from the Centre for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, and they have Hungary right up there on top, at risk of public media of losing independence. But not just Hungary. Poland, Italy, Spain, Greece, your country, France, and Germany is quite low down there. But France as well, another interesting example. I mean, we have in France the example of one multi-billionaire owning a number of TV channels, a publishing house, many radios, Vincent Bolloré. I mean, controlling like tight grip on many of the medias there.
Well, certainly, and that does have an impact, is when one owner has a big conglomeration of a bunch of media outlets, it obviously, I mean, sure, there's some owners that clearly, take a step back and say, okay, I believe in a free press, but that's really dependent on one person or one company that's owning it, what their perspective on that's going to be. And I think it's really important to remember that, journalists constantly are trying to, the goal of journalism is to bring truth to the public, shed light in dark places, and, bring into knowledge to things that people necessarily want to hide. And I think that nowadays we're seeing a more tense relationship with politicians and the press, and that antagonization is just really making it harder and harder for journalists to do their job.
And in France, they want to have the right to be able to spy on journalists when it comes to cases of national security. Comment on that, Petros, and also the fact that you're Greek, because we also remember the Pegasus scandal.
Yeah, not so long ago.
Which gave us all goosebumps.
Indeed. So that thing is happening. Indeed, state-controlled secret services, perhaps it goes even farther than that, have been spying on journalists and political leaders. So this is indeed something that is documented, it's happening, and it's very welcome that the EU is stepping in and is adopting regulation. I certainly hope that the member states are not going to try to water this down. We already...
Well, they are, because if you just take a look at how Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary, was reacting, he took to Twitter to directly attack the commissioner in charge of this dossier, Vera Jourova. He said, another anti-freedom proposal from Brussels, establishing total control over the media. I mean, people reading that back in Hungary are believing what he's saying there. And I mean, we've been speaking to journalists who've been working on these issues, and lawyers and professors for so many years in order to get some clarity and some legal teeth, because as we saw, some of this could end up in courts. I mean, this is very serious.
Some of the things that I think that we see mayors are concerned about is this access to information that is provided in a way that is understandable, that isn't misguiding or misleading or even faked, actually. And we're seeing that maybe there is a polemic now around, for example, the 15-minute city. Is it a complot against the freedom or individual freedoms?
I'm a big fan of that. Just explain to our viewers what it is, the 15-minute city idea.
So, yeah, the 15-minute city idea is really sort of a proposal for reflection on livable cities, neighborhood scale. How do we make cities accessible in terms of access to green, to services? How can you and make mobility easy around the city? So it's not something really. The basis of the proposal is not something that's opposed. It's a way of thinking about larger cities and how do we make them more livable.
Okay.
So we're seeing that these sort of slightly twisted presentations of what it really is that comes into play on platforms where
that would be a big challenge, of course, as well next year.
Of course,
when it comes to election time, disinformation and trying to figure out what is true and what is fake. But I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for watching. See you soon. Hello there, welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show. I'm Maeve McMahon and saw this week that the EU's new climate chief, Wopke Hoekstra, was given that green light from MEPs to take up his new job. His challenge now will be to implement the EU Green Deal. And a slice of that deal was presented this week in Brussels, the European Cycling Declaration, inspired by countries like Belgium, Ireland, the Netherlands and Denmark, who want to double the number of cyclists by 2030 and want 2024 to be the official year of the bicycle. What are your thoughts on the fact that bicycles and cycling are being put up so high there on the political agenda?
We now finally have something, a European level initiative that puts cycling in the centre of a wider sort of mobility, sustainable mobility picture. I think we've seen many initiatives over the years in cities promoting cycling, but that sort of initiative that brings together at European level also brings in national level activities as well that promote cycling.
And companies getting on board too. I've seen like Mercedes-Benz, Audi, Porsche, all getting on the bike as in the e-bike, because they know that it's doing very well, with 1 in 4 bikes in Europe today being electric. Petrus, a quick reaction?
It is very welcome indeed. I think commuters need more choice. That car has dominated our life for far too long for a variety of reasons, some of them very good. But I think we need to give more options to consumer, both in terms of public transport, whether it's buses and trains, but also the ability to take their bike for shorter distances too.
Do you bike, Petrus?
I do bike, unfortunately not as much as I should.
No, I don't like bicycles, but I think it's really great. I think it's great that people are cycling. I'm pro-cyclist, but I'm not a cyclist.
So are you anti the declaration on biking?
No, I think it's lovely, but,
Okay.
I don't use it myself.
Well, let's hear how people out and about on the streets of Brussels feel, not just cyclists, but also road users. Louise Albertus and Paul Larocque-Oppenau were out asking them what they feel about the EU promoting biking.
It would be great, I think, but we need safer roads then. And I really would enjoy if my children could ride safely in the city.
Of course, I agree with that idea.
Maybe, yes, it could be great here in Brussels, but also in other parts of Europe, to promote cycling and, a more healthier lifestyle.
Cycling is great, but in Brussels it's pretty dangerous.
Make the city suitable for bikes. Then investing in actual bikes and providing services to people, I think that's pretty important.
I think it's necessary to make a change in the world.
We need more bikes and we need less cars, a lot less cars, please.
Well, never enough bikes. They don't pollute, they're healthy for yourself, and they make the city more nice. Well, actually, I'm on my way to take a velo. So I think if we all do our contribution, we'll get there.
So that's a glimpse there of what people here in Brussels during rush hour think. Obviously, Dorothy, their answers would have been very different if we drove out 30 kilometres outside the city to the countryside, because there, of course, it's not so simple just to give up your bike. But I'd like to get back to that point on being dangerous. Kate, you said you didn't bike. Is that because it's too dangerous?
I think that bicycles are great. I do think we need responsible cyclists, though. As someone who's a pedestrian who uses my feet most of the time to get around, I have had some incidents with bicycles sometimes, and I've seen other incidents with bicycles. So I think as long as people are respecting the rules, there's really no problem, and it's great.
And they're not. Let's be honest. I mean, I bike every day, and I see cyclists break the rules every day. So, Dorothy, will there be some plans, do you think, in this promotional campaign to make sure that cyclists also obey by the rules and be fined quickly if they do break them?
Yes, well, of course, I mean, the traffic rules should apply to everybody, of course, and it's also education of the cyclist population. I think what is really important in the declaration that's been adopted is that road safety is actually addressed. We would have liked to seen also more measures, for example, on speed limits as well in cities. But there's a lot to do as well, I think, with sort of quality infrastructure, so that users of the roads, whether it's cars, fewer cars, so hopefully bikes, the scooters and pedestrians.
That's another discussion. And also the rodeo drivers, those crazy drivers in Brussels who speed at all hours of the day and night, that are very upsetting to all of us here. But I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you so much to our guest, to Dorothy Nielsen from Eurocities, Petrus Vasoulas from the European Movement, and Kate Bolingaro from MLEX. If you do have any comments for us, do reach out. Our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. We're also on Instagram. See you soon.